Hi, in this video we're going to be discussing the challenges that life on land presents to plants and what adaptations the plants have to deal with those challenges. Keep in mind you can pause the video at any time if I'm going too fast for you to take notes. Also make sure that you note any questions you have so we can discuss them in class. If living on land presents challenges to plants, let's talk about why they moved to land in the first place. Recall that plants evolved from algae ancestors that lived in the water. One of the reasons why plants made the move to land is that there were a lot of resources available. Carbon dioxide, sunlight, and minerals are all very plentiful on land and in the air. Additionally, at the time the plants made the move to land, there were very few competitors for those resources because most life was in the water. And at the time, since animals had not moved out of the water yet, there were very few predators as well. When plants moved to land, they changed the world. The first effect they had was of the atmosphere. Plants, as you know, do photosynthesis, and as they photosynthesize, turning carbon dioxide into energy and producing oxygen as waste, they dramatically increase the oxygen content of the air and reduce the carbon dioxide content. They increase oxygen so much that oxygen is 21% of our atmosphere. Plants also help create soil. Soil has two main parts: weathered rock and decaying material or organic material. Plants help the rock to weather. They're involved in weathering, and plants also make up much of the decaying matter of soil. Additionally, by plants colonizing land, it also meant that there were resources available for other organisms like fungi and animals. Let's take a minute to review. Living on land presented a number of challenges for plants, and so consequently they evolved a number of adaptations to deal with those challenges. Let's discuss them. First, if plants were living out of the water, the first challenge was how do plants get water into their bodies? So plants evolved a root system. Basically, it's a highly adapted organ that is evolved to transport water into the plant. Among the adaptations that roots have is increased surface area. So roots, as you know, are very, very branched. What you may not know is that even the branches that we see, like if you were to draw the roots of a tree, if you were to zoom in on that, they would have lots of tiny microscopic hairs on them that increase the surface area for water to be absorbed. Once the water is into the roots have to keep the water rather than let them diffuse back out into the soil. So the Casparian strip becomes very important. It's important for the plant function that there be a lot of water in the roots so it can travel up the plant. And so the Casparian strips helps hold the water into the center. This picture is of a cross section of a plant. The Casparian strip is this red structure. Water is pumped into the structure, and then the Casparian strip, which is made up of a waterproof material, essentially a waxy kind of material, prevents the water from diffusing back out of the root and out of the central area of the leaf. I think I've used the word active transport. Active transport is a cell's way of using energy to do work. In this case, the work is moving water against the concentration gradient into the core of the root. Another challenge plants face is keeping the water they've obtained. As you know, water evaporates in air, so another challenge is how do plants prevent desiccation, or in other words, drying out. Additionally, plants have to be able to breathe. If you over waterproof, there won't be enough gas exchange. So plants have a number of adaptations to do this, and the first one is a cuticle. The cuticle is what you see in this top picture here. It's the shiny outer layer of the plant. It's made of a lipid, a wax, that is impermeable to water. Water doesn't dissolve in it, and so therefore water doesn't pass out of the plant through that material. And consequently, it decreases evaporation. Some plants have seeds, and some of those seeds have a seed coat, which functions very much like a cuticle by preventing evaporation and keeping the water in the seed. What you see in the second picture here are trichomes. Trichomes are little fuzzy hairs that we have on plants. You can sometimes feel them more easily than you can see them. Those little hairs trap water and once again slow down the rate of evaporation. Finally, plants also have what we call a guard cell, which are these structures right here. Inside the dark area in this picture is actually a hole or a pore of the plant, and the guard cells are the cells on the outside. And they serve to prevent evaporation let me rephrase that. They serve to prevent gas exchange when the water inside the plant is limited. The way that guard cells work is that they have, as all plants do, a large central vacuole. The vacuole is the structure that holds the water. When the plant has enough water, that central vacuole will be full with water. It will put pressure on the outside of the vacuole, and the cells will plump up. Their natural shape is this kidney bean shape, and so when they plump up, they take on that rounded shape that creates the opening or the stoma in the middle of the two guard cells. If water inside the cells are in short demand, the vacuoles deflate. The plants lose their pressure that keeps that shape, and they close up. When water becomes plentiful again, those vacuoles fill up and it opens. And so it's in this way that plants can control when gas exchange occurs, limiting excess water loss. Let's take a minute and review. Another challenge that plants meet is the sources of the Another challenge to living on land is the fact that the resources plants need come from multiple sources. So, as you probably know, plants get minerals and water from the roots, and they get gases from the air. That requires that plants have Another challenge to life on land is the sources of the resources. In the water, algae is completely surrounded by water, and that water generally has the resources that Another challenge that living on land poses is where resources come from. In water, the resources are pretty much all in the water, so the plant is completely surrounded by the minerals and the dissolved gases and the water that it needs. So a lot of times they can just diffuse the resources in and out of the organism. On land, the resources come from specific sources, such as the soil and the air. Of course, water and minerals generally come from the soil, and gases come from the air. The solution to getting resources from those different sources is differentiated tissues and organs. So the structures in the roots and the leaves are specialized to get the resources they need from those sources. Another challenge to life on land is just how do you move the water against the force of gravity? In the water, everything is surrounded by Gravity presents a number of challenges for plants who lack the buoyancy that organisms in the water have. One of the challenges is transporting materials against the flow of gravity. So, as we mentioned, some resources are taken from the soil at the bottom and some resources are taken from the air at the top, and the material needs to move throughout the plant by going up and down. The solution to this is vascular tissue. Vascular tissue basically functions like pipes or tubes. There's two kinds. There's phloem, which transports sugar, and it can go in both directions. And there's xylem, which transports water up the plant through a process known as transpiration, which we'll get to later in the unit. Not only do plants have to worry about transporting materials against the force of gravity, they have to worry about holding themselves up against the force of gravity. In the water, buoyancy aids in this, but in land, plants are left to their own. So they have a number of ways to do this, including the cell structure. Recall from your biology class that animal cells lack cell walls, but plant cells have cell walls. Animal cells need the mobility, and they usually have other support mechanisms like bones or exoskeletons, whereas plant cells, they need that additional help at the cellular level. So, to begin with, they have the cell wall, as I mentioned. The cell walls are made up of a chemical known as cellulose. It's a polysaccharide with lots of cross bonds, and those cross bonds add strength. And plants also have the vacuole that we saw in the guard cells. When the vacuole is full, the water pressure from the vacuole pushes against the outsides of the plant, making it erect, making the plant stand upright. If the water is low in the plant, the vacuole shrivels a little bit, and there's no longer pressure pushing on the outside of the cell wall, or the inside of the cell walls pushing out, and the plant gets droopy. Additionally, vascular tissue, those tubes that help transport material, also serve as supports themselves. They have a chemical known as lignin, which is what makes wood hard. And so, consequently, it provides very sturdy support. So, it's essentially like having great big metal pipes that hold up the plant. Lignin also often hardens in the cells, making the plants rigid and providing stiffness in the stems. Let's take another minute and review. Reproduction is also different on land. In the water, sperm can swim to the egg in order to fertilize the egg. However, on land, there needs to be alternative adaptations. Many plants rely on pollinators such as bees and other insects and birds. Other plants rely on wind, and there's a number of other mechanisms we'll discuss as well. Plants also have a very unique reproductive style called alternation of generation. Alternation of generation is basically having two generations within one plant. So a plant will have a haploid life stage, in other words, where it has one copy of the chromosome, and that will be multicellular, and it will have a diploid time in its life where it has two copies of the chromosomes, which is also multicellular. One of the generations produces spores, and we call that the sporophyte. The other one produces gametes, which we call the gametophyte. Now, we'll talk about alternation of generations, more of what it is in detail in a later note session. But here's a really simple overview. If we start with what we're familiar with humans, sperm and egg joining, we get fertilization. And that creates a diploid, or in other words, an individual who has a copy of chromosomes from a mom and a copy of chromosomes from a dad, just like us. So we're a diploid, or 2N. That develops into what we call a sporophyte, and for many plants it's the form that we recognize, like a tree. This sporophyte can then produce spores. Spores are haploid, in other words, have one copy of the chromosome, and this is asexual reproduction. In other words, one plant makes multiple spores. Each one of these spores can go on to be a fully functioning multicellular organism, and so it's asexual reproduction. Each spore then can make a sperm and an egg, and so that's called the gametophyte, when it starts the process all over again. So, why have such a complicated life cycle? Well, as we mentioned, reproducing on land is tough. So, by having a sporophyte that can produce asexually and a gametophyte that can produce sexually, both of which can make multiple offspring, it increases the output of sexual reproduction. In other words, they have more chances to reproduce. This also allows plants to take advantage of different conditions at different times. So, for example, some of the plants can have a prolonged life cycle that's a sporophyte. Other plants can have a prolonged life cycle that's a gametophyte, and some have prolonged life cycles of both. How did this even happen? Well, it's possible that delayed meiosis might have resulted in this alternation of generation, and that might have provided this favorable characteristics to be naturally selected. This is kind of a confusing concept, so don't worry if you don't get alternation of generations now. We'll talk about it more in depth later on. Let's take a minute and review. Another challenge to plants colonizing land is dispersing their offspring. If all of the offspring fell right at the base of a plant, they'd all be competing with one another and with the parent plant. In the water, currents simply carry this away. On land, we need other adaptations to do this. One way is simply delaying the development of the embryo. So plants, a lot of them have an embryo that contains its own food source. It's called an endosperm. When we eat seeds, that's what stores so much energy and provides us with so many nutrients. That endosperm allows the seed to wait until favorable conditions are met. And so that can be a long time, potentially. Additionally, they have that seed coat we mentioned to prevent it from drying out. And finally, most plants that have seeds also have structures to help distribute those seeds. So some, you're probably familiar with the dandelion that catches the wind. Others, like burrs, catch on to animals or are in fruit that can be dispersed by animals after they defecate. Some burst open. And so we have a whole bunch of adaptations in seeds that help disperse their offspring. Let's take another minute and review. Another challenge for plants is that they're immobile. And so having access to resources is very limited to them because they can't move around in their environment like animals can. And unlike in the water, there's no flow of water to bring new resources in. Consequently, plants have to be very adapted to their climate and their niche in general. So we see lots of diversity in plants, from trees to shrubs to herbaceous plants, and all different kinds of adaptations from evergreens to palm trees. Tying right into this is the differences in weather that plants have to deal with. Conditions in air change much, much faster and more dramatically than conditions in water. You've probably experienced this. In the spring, when the temperatures are warming up, it takes seemingly forever for the water to feel warm enough to comfortably swim in. But the air one day can be 80 degrees, and the next night it can be 30 degrees. And so the air changes very, very quickly. Therefore, consequently, plants have all kinds of adaptations to help them deal with fluctuating conditions. Um, some plants are adapted to survive fire, which is like the ultimate fluctuating conditions. Other plants are adapted to survive extreme drought, survive in the snow with the heavy weight of the snow and the surprisingly low amount of water, even though snow is water. And obviously, plants around here are adapted to survive multiple seasons. Finally, plants also have to deal with disease. And on land, there's multiple sources of disease and infection. So there's a lot of resources plants have for this. Adaptations such as cuticle serve not only as a barrier for water, but also a barrier for infection. Trichomes also, again, for water, and make it tougher for invaders to reach the plant. Many plants produce toxins and enzymes and other chemicals to deter invaders and predators, actually. And it's also important to know that there's a lot about plant defense, or in other words, plant immune systems, that humans just don't understand because they don't have the same kind of immune system that animals have. So there's a lot of research in this field. Let's review one last time. That's it for this section of notes. Make sure that if you have any questions, you bring them up during class when we review.